start our recording. So welcome everyone. Excited to have you all for week 7. We are week 7 of 8, so we are getting close to the end, and it is good to see you here. Bob, for your context, we have some credit students that you see mostly on the screen here. Got a couple dozen more webinar participants joining in webinar format, and we've got about 260 signed on, many of whom watch the recording later. So a variety of people in different contexts. But we are here today to talk about politics and advocacy related to climate change. And I have two guest speakers today. We've got Bob Inglis first, who I will introduce in a moment. And Bob, we actually have Bill McKibben coming on after you. So a fun evening that we'll have here together with some real high profile speakers who have been around the block a few times related to this. And I think you're going to enjoy both of our speakers tonight. So let me start off and introduce Bob. Bob is the executive director of Republic EN, which you will hear much more about as he talks in a moment, and is considered a leading expert in market-based climate policy solutions, and does a lot of talking about free market solutions to climate change, and you will find this really interesting. I always really enjoy having Bob talk to this class, and Bob very generously has come to other classes of mine as well, because the solution that he brings is one that is not only effective for addressing climate change, but actually very consistent with many conservative free market principles as well. So it's a solution that both can actually work on the climate crisis, but actually can be politically feasible as well, even in the polarized climate we have today. Bob also spent 12 years serving as a congressman from South Carolina in the United States House of Representatives from 1993 to 1998, and again from 2005 to 2010. And he is also the recipient of the 2015 John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award, a prestigious award awarded to an individual who has a distinguished, courageous service for the public service. And you are going to enjoy what he has to say. So Bob, I think I will go ahead and turn it over to you, and welcome. Thank you for coming to join us today.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be with you. And wonderful to have the opportunity to talk with so many folks through the miracles of technology. And so I thought I'd start with a story, and then talk about the policy options available to us. I guess I better do this. I better tell a story, then tell how I got to this, and then talk about those policy options. So the story goes like this. Once upon a time, there was agreement among the parties, the Republican Party and Democratic Party, that we needed to do something about climate change. And then there was a big storm that hit. It wasn't Hurricane Irma or Hurricane Matthew or one of those. It was a global financial crisis. And that led to the Great Recession. And then polarization set in a big way with the election of Barack Obama to the White House and the Republican Party's decision to do things like call him a secret Muslim, non-American socialist. That really set things on edge. And then we spent a whole decade in that position of basically disputing climate change, the evidence of climate change. But here's the good news. The story isn't finished yet, but it appears that Republicans, my party, are coming back to the conversation and are ready to engage on solutions for climate change. And so the rest of the story we've got to write together to figure out whether it's going to work to have conservatives joining with progressives to solve the challenge of climate change. So that's really the story. We were together, then we drew apart. And in the process now of Republicans coming back, we find some movement on the left, further left, that we need to figure out how to sort of bring them back more toward regular or regular order or to normal policy preferences, rather than being way over in a spot where the perfect becomes the enemy of the good. And so both parties, in order to write a good ending to this story, will have to have some changes. The Democratic Party will have to speak to some of its more extreme elements and say, you know what, maybe it's a little bit much to ask that we repent of the capitalistic system and go some completely different direction. Maybe it's a bit too much to ask in the midst of an emergency about climate change. And for those on the right, we need to say, you know what, really, it's getting obvious about climate change. And it's not just the few exceptional Republicans who need to be talking about solutions. It's all Republicans. That those two things happening, the left sort of coming back to a more centrist position on climate, and Republicans coming to a centrist position, then we can write a good ending to this story. But so that's where I'd start, is the story of climate change and how it happened that we got to a decade of disastrous disputation, as we call it at republican.org. People who dispute climate science take offense at being called deniers because they say that's equating them with Holocaust denial. So we give them the courtesy of calling them disputers. So it's a decade of disastrous disputation. The good news is what started in 2008 with that storm, that global financial crisis and the Great Recession, ended in 2018 when my party lost control of the U.S. House. And it has dawned on Kevin McCarthy, he who would be Speaker if Republicans take control, that you can't maintain a Republican majority in the House with a retro position on climate change, because you can't win suburban districts that way. And if you can't win suburban districts, you can't maintain the majority. And so that's dawned on Kevin. And he and others are trying to figure out a way to go with the flow here. And here's the thing I would tell you. The river is going to flow. America is going to act on climate change, and we're going to lead the world to solutions. The only question in the writing the end of the story is how quickly we conclude the story. If we conclude it quickly enough, we could avoid the worst consequences of climate change. If we continue to dither, then what we have is larger and larger consequences. But I got to say this politically, because we're talking about the politics as well as the policy here. If in my metaphor there's a river that's going to flow, there's a rock in the river. It has a red hat on it. And from that rock, the guy with the red hat plans on doubling down on climate disputation and eking out one more victory, just one more. So he's got a very short time horizon. Meanwhile, people like Kevin McCarthy, who I just mentioned, he'd like to be Speaker longer term, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, 32. He'd probably like to be Speaker all those years. And he knows the river is going to flow past that rock. But he's sort of pulled up in his kayak. I've done a little bit of whitewater, just a little bit. He's sort of pulled up in his kayak on the right-hand side of the river, and he's studying the river to figure out how to run past that rock. That's really where we are right at this moment. A lot of turbulence around the rock. But the confidence I'd give you is the river is going to flow. And the story is going to be written that America stepped up and solved climate change. It's just hopefully there are not many pages to this story, that we actually get the story concluded here pretty soon. Okay, so first thing I want to do then is tell you that story. Second thing to do here is tell you how I got to this, because it does seem a little bit odd, doesn't it? That, how did a conservative member of Congress from South Carolina get so hepped up on climate? It seems unlikely, doesn't it? It's a liberal cause. So what about it? Inglis, how'd you get to this thing of being a conservative who cares about climate change? So it's like this. I spent 6 years in Congress denying climate change. I didn't know anything about it, except that Al Gore was for it. And in as much as I represented a very conservative district in South Carolina, Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina, one of the 6 U.S. House districts back then. South Carolina has grown a lot. Now we've got 7 U.S. House districts. So I represented that conservative district, and I said climate change must be hooey because it's a Democrat thing, and I'm a Republican. Okay, so I admit that's pretty ignorant, but that's the way it was for my first 6 years in Congress. Then I was out of Congress 6 years doing commercial real estate law again in Greenville, South Carolina. Had the opportunity to run for the same seat again in 2004. That was the year that our son, the eldest of our 5 kids, had just turned 18. So he was voting for the first time. And he came to me in that race and he said, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." His 4 sisters agreed. His mother agreed. That constitutes a new constituency. These people have the ability to change the locks on the doors to your house. And so very important to respond to those people. So that was step 1 of a 3-step metamorphosis. By the way, my son was going to vote for me no matter what, right? It wasn't in his economic interest to vote against me. You can lose by 1 vote. And he knew that we were mortgaging literally the farmette that we live on. Farmette, that's not when you're not really a farmer. You just pretend to be a farmer. So like Green Acres TV show is what we do here in Travelers Rest, South Carolina. He knew we were mortgaging the farmette. So he was going to vote for me no matter what. I think he was really saying was, "Dad, I love you. And you can be better than you were before. So how about make this Inglis 2.0, the new and improved version?" So that was step 1 of the metamorphosis. Step 2 is going to Antarctica and seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings. Here's a fun fact to know and tell. The South Pole is a desert. It gets 1/4 of an inch of precipitation a year. And it's 10,000 feet above sea level, 5,000 feet of dirt, and then 5,000 feet of ice. So in the roughly mile of ice, we've got an amazing record of the Earth's atmosphere. And there and elsewhere in Antarctica, what happens is the scientists just drill down through the ice, pull up cores, ice cores, and put them in coolers, fly them off to the freezers at the Bird Polar Research Center at Ohio State University, and study the ice. And so what it shows is stable levels of CO2, and then an uptick coincident with the Industrial Revolution, which just makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, if I'm, burning wood to heat my house and cook my food before the Industrial Revolution, I'm not really adding much to greenhouse gases, because that tree was in the same geological time period taking CO2 out of the air in its life process. And now by burning it to cook my food or heat the house, I'm just reintroducing that into the same time period. But if you go deep in the earth and you pull up trees long gone and under time and temperature and pressure have been turned into fossil fuels, petroleum, natural gas, coal, you bring that to the surface and burn them, you're changing the chemistry of the air in this geological time. By the way, no one disputes that. Not even the most ardent disputer of climate change disputes that. In fact, it's indisputable because it's a chemical equation. And as you remember from high school chemistry or maybe college chemistry, there's an equal sign in that equation, and it's got a balance on both sides. And so if you burn fossil fuels, there is no doubt about it, you are increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Nobody disputes that. So then what I also learned is the physics of light are that have been known since the 1800s, by the way. It's not new science. Are that light comes from the sun, strikes the earth, creates heat. All that heat doesn't go back into space because of the presence of greenhouse gases. Thank the Lord. If it did, we'd sort of be burning up hot during the day and freezing at night. I mean, the presence of those greenhouse gases is a blessing because it moderates the temperature of the earth and keeps us at a range that human civilization can flourish. So you add more though, and you get heat, you get warming, and that's pretty clear. And again, not much disputing there. Where the disputing comes is in the modeling. How much sea level rise in Naples, Florida, where I just was today, versus say Hilton Head, South Carolina, where I grew up? Well, that's really difficult to model because the difference is on the West Coast, the West Gulf Coast of Florida, you don't have the Gulf Stream zipping by like we do on the East Coast, 70 miles out from Hilton Head. So that current flying past Hilton Head makes it so it sort of sucks water with it and keeps the sea level from rising a bit. So it'll be different at Naples as opposed to Hilton Head. And if we're asking climate scientists to tell us exactly how much sea level rise will there be in those two very different locations, well, that's a tough job. That's a lot of computations. And so that's where the disputing comes. So this is what I learned in Antarctica. That was second step of this metamorphosis. Step 3 of my metamorphosis on climate was another science committee trip and something of a spiritual awakening, which seems unlikely, doesn't it, on a godless science committee trip, because we all know that all scientists are godless. Apparently not, though, because this Aussie climate scientist who was showing me the glories of the Great Barrier Reef and the challenge of coral bleaching, I could tell shared my worldview because I could see that he was worshiping God and what he was showing me as we snorkeled together, seeing the reef. Because we go down, he'd show me something, he'd come to the surface, he'd be all excited. It was in his eyes, it was written all over his face, it was in the excitement in his voice that he was worshiping God and what he was showing me. So I knew we shared a worldview. You know, St. Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. And so Scott Heron, who's become now a very dear friend, was preaching the gospel, and I heard it. And so he told me about conservation changes later when we had the snorkels out of our mouths that he was making in his life in order to love God and love people. He rides his bike to work, does without air conditioning in Townsville, Australia, a pretty hot place. Hangs the family's clothes out of the line, all to consciously love people coming after us. So I got right inspired. I wanted to be like Scott, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. Note to self, do not introduce carbon tax in midst of Great Recession when you represent perhaps the reddest district in the reddest state of the nation. It will not go well. And it did not go well at all. After 12 years in Congress, I got 29% of the vote in a Republican primary runoff. The other guy got the other 71%. So rather spectacular faceplant in politics. At that point, a foundation came to me and said, Inglis, you're pretty unusual, an actual conservative who cares about climate change. Will you speak and write for the proposition? That's what I've been doing ever since. By the way, those ratings, when they say you're an actual conservative, 93 American Conservative Union rating, 100% Christian Coalition, 100% National Right to Life, A with the NRA, 0 with the Americans for Democratic Action. That's a liberal group. And 23 by some mistake with the AFL-CIO, the labor union. I was really gunning for a 0. I don't know how I got 23. So they said, an actual conservative. Who cares about climate? And so, what have we been doing ever since is basically doing this thing called republicen.org. It's a team of us facilitating a community about 20,000 right now that makes visible conservatives to members of Congress. And so we need to grow that number. And if you'd like to join us, we'd love to have you. If you're a conservative who cares about climate change, go to republican.org. The join button will follow you wherever you go at that site. And if you click on the join button, all we need is your zip code and your email address, and we will make you visible and audible to your member of Congress and to your 2 senators. And so it's, and the reason we need to be visible and audible is, as I said in that outset with that story I was telling, conservative members of Congress are starting to know that the species exist, conservatives who care about climate. But they really need to have more sightings of individuals of the species. If they do, they will flock with that species, and good things will happen. And that story that we were writing earlier will have a happy conclusion. So we need to make you visible and audible. And so join us and we'll help you do that. So that's how I got to this. So I've told you the story about climate change and how we got to a decade of disastrous disputation, and how now Republicans are coming back to the conversation, and how it is that we need to together write the end of that story. Second thing I've done here is told you how I got to this, this metamorphosis that I had. Third thing I think I should do here is just run quickly through the policy options available to us as a country and really as the world. It's just really 3 different policy kind of approaches that we could develop to solve climate change. You can regulate emissions, you can incentivize clean energy, or you can figure out a way to make dirty products accountable for all of their side effects. So it's one of those 3 things, really. First, you can regulate. That solution doesn't come naturally to us, as you might expect, as an outfit called republican.org. We sort of break out in hives when you start talking about regulations. We get all itchy and bothered by that thought. But even if we didn't have that visceral reaction to the mention of regulations, we'd point out there's a weakness in the regulatory approach, which is that you can't regulate Chinese emissions from here in America. And if you regulate here and they don't regulate there, manufacturers may pick up and move from here to there. Once they get there, they'll emit more CO2 than they were emitting here, because we are way more energy efficient than China is. And so the result is you might go downhill on solving climate change. Because the reason that climate change is so devilish of a problem is that emissions anywhere are climate change everywhere. And so the challenge is you've got to get the whole world in on this. If you're just doing it in one country, as important as the United States is, it's not alone able to solve climate change. So the second approach is to incentivize clean energy. And if I were still in Congress, I'd be voting for some of these things. Expanded credits for wind and solar, those are tax credits. Maybe direct expenditures for EV charging stations, I'd be for that. Surely R&D on batteries and small modular nukes, and surely R&D on direct air capture. That's the idea of sucking CO2 out of the air, basically. I'd be voting for all those things. But the ones that I started in this list were the tax credits that are really driving wind and solar. And the thing about those is that you can successfully incentivize American corporations through credits in the American tax code because they pay American taxes. Problem is, you can't incentivize Chinese corporations. They don't pay American taxes. And so the same problem exists in this second approach, clean energy incentives, as exists in that regulatory approach. which is you might succeed in cleaning up local air. The regulations here in America say regulating down to 350 parts per million, just straight up regulate it. Or these tax incentives that don't go worldwide. You might clean up local air, fewer asthma cases. You're getting rid of the CO2. CO2 doesn't cause asthma, but while you're controlling that CO2, you're probably also taking out some of the small particulates that cause asthma, for example. So you'd improve life expectancy here in America. Good things would be happening here locally, but you're not yet getting the whole world in. Now, somebody could say to me about this, about the clean energy incentives, yeah, but Inglis, if we do those clean energy incentives here in America, early adoption will cause the price of that technology to come down. Well, I hope so. I don't know so, and I'll tell you why. The market might be quite small. So, for example, in the power production business, there are only 20 or 30,000 companies in the whole world that make electricity for customers. That's a small market. It's a boutique market where prices are high, volume is low. Contrast that, for example, with cell phones. Cell phone market is huge. 7 billion people would like one of these. So the result is each unit comes way down in cost or way down in price because there's such a large market, and you can do the Walmart strategy, which is high volume, low margin. So if that's the case and the price sticks in a boutique market up pretty high, then enrich America with corporations incentivized through the tax code, we can get adoption of that technology. But the question is, will you get it in the whole world? And if not, you're not solving climate change. So that leads us with the third option, which clearly I favor because I'm saving it for last and I've dissed the other two, is figuring out some way to make the side effects of dirty stuff to be counted into the price of products. And that's what we think is the real way to write a very happy ending to the story that I was writing at the outset. Is just figure a way to get dirty to reveal all of its cost to all of us as consumers. And then on the shelves of grocery stores and every other kind of store, we'll be faced with a choice between dirty that's been made accountable, and therefore its price reflects that, and clean being relatively cheaper because it doesn't have the side effects of dumping into the atmosphere, let's say. So let me give you an example. Let's say I'm Inglis Industries. I make a useful product to society. My process is sort of stinky. I pollute the air with some CO2 and some small particulates. The CO2 causes climate change worldwide, but the small particulates end up in my neighbor's lungs. Most of them cough it up and go along. Some of them end up in the hospital. They're disproportionately poor and disproportionately of color because my plant has cheap, relatively cheap residential real estate next door to it because nobody wants to live next door to my stinky plant. So the price of that real estate's pretty low. Poor people, people of color live there. Stinks for them because I foul their lungs. But it's pretty good news for my customers because pretty good deal, really. My customers get a cheap widget because I'm not held to account for that cost. So those neighbors go to the hospital. I don't pay that asthma admission. And therefore it's not reflected in the price of my product. So it's a pretty good deal for my customers. Stinks for my neighbors. Meanwhile, there's a competitor I've got across town. She's got a cleaner process. She has a newer equipment. She doesn't belch and burn into the trash dump of the sky. She sequesters her CO2, let's say. And because she's got all that equipment that she's got to pay for it, a bank loan, she's got to charge more for her product. And I beat her every day in the marketplace. Stinks for her, great for me, because her price is higher than mine. And customers choose me over her unless they've got a lot of money and they just decide to shine their halo by buying the green stuff. But meanwhile, most people don't have the disposable income to buy the green stuff, so they keep on buying my supposedly cheap stuff. And so what we dream of is actually a carbon tax. Yes, a carbon tax. Oh, what conservative would talk about a new tax? Well, let's talk about this carbon tax. And I just said the word, and the ground did not swallow me up here in South Carolina, so it must be all right. Huh? So this carbon tax would be pretty special in a couple ways. One is it'd be revenue neutral if you do it the way I'd like to do it and the way conservatives would like to do it. That means you cut taxes somewhere else, or you dividend all the money from the new carbon tax back to the citizenry. So there's no growth of government. So if you're going to, it's just changing what you tax. It's untaxing, say, income if you were reducing payroll taxes, let's say, or doing the dividend, same sort of thing. You're giving the money back to citizens. So you're not growing the government. You're just putting a new tax on the dirty stuff. That would bring accountability to me at Inglis Industries. Because now all those inputs that I'm burning, you know, the fossil fuels that I'm burning to make my stinky product, or no, my product's good, but it's a stinky process. All those things I'm burning my stinky process would be more expensive. And I'd have to cover that expense in the price of my product that I charge for my product. So at that point, the gal across town's cleaner process produces a widget that's now on the shelves next door to mine at Walmart. And mine is showing its true cost. The side effects are now built into it, into the pricing. And so consumers start choosing the cheaper over the cleaner because it's cheaper. And so that's one way that this would be a special tax. It'd be a revenue neutral tax. The other thing it'd be is border adjustable. And this is the thing that really we sing about at republican.org, because this is the way to make a very happy ending to that story that I started with. This is the way that carbon pricing, it's called, or building in the negative effects of adding those to the price of products so that dirty becomes accountable. This is the way it goes worldwide. Because we would apply the tax. It's called a carbon border adjustment. We would apply our carbon tax to goods coming into an American port from a country that doesn't have the same carbon tax. So take an example. A sheet of flat steel is coming through the port of Seattle today. It's just landed there. We might complain that they stole our technology, they've manipulated their currency, and it sure is hard for a free people to figure out how to deal with a state-run economy. So here it comes. The sheet of flat steel is coming in through the port of Seattle. We apply our American carbon tax. And that China objects in the World Trade Organization. They say, you can't do that. That's an impermissible tariff. We think they lose that case in the World Trade Organization based on precedents in the chemical industry that say that you can have a content tax on stuff coming into your country based on the content of the stuff. If we're right, and it's upheld because this would be a carbon content tax, China, 24 hours after they lose the case in the World Trade Organization, would have the same carbon tax internal to China. Why? Because they just paid in Seattle an American carbon tax that got sent to Washington. If they had collected that tax inside of China, the tax money would have ended up in Beijing, and the sheet of flat steel would come through the port of Seattle with no adjustment. So 24 hours later, they got this, because they do have an amazing way of reaching consensus. I mean, it really would take them 24 hours. Not a very fair government, not a very nice government, but they are doggone efficient. And so 24 hours later, they got the same price on carbon dioxide, the same carbon tax. Then the whole world's following. Because if you're doing business anywhere in the world, you're doing business with the US and China. Then you've got what we were talking about a minute ago, is 7 billion people seeing dirty made accountable, all of its side effects built into its price. That's when the free enterprise system can deliver innovation. We at republican.org say that what we have here is a problem of economics that has an environmental consequence. Fix economics, and the environment will take care of itself. Because free people at that point will be choosing in their self-interest cleaner over dirty, because dirty now has all of its cost built in. And the result is, wow, innovation happens rapidly. So that's our story. That's our song. We think it's an exciting way to end, write a conclusion to the story I started with. And I should add this. If what I've just described sounds familiar and you're thinking, gee, Inglis describes it in high octane conservative terms, he keeps on throwing the words free enterprise and such, but it sounds familiar and I'm a progressive, you might be saying to yourself. Well, it might be because what I've just described in a revenue neutral border adjustable carbon tax is the same thing that Al Gore has been for about 30 years. I asked him a couple of years ago if I could tell people that. He said, well, hold on, Bob. If you're talking about a low price, I said, no, sir, we're talking about a substantial price on carbon dioxide that's steadily rising. He said, well, fine then. Yes, you can tell people that what you're for is what I've been for about 30 years. And so we have this hope that you could actually bring America together. Once conservatives hear it in their own language and realize that they have a solution that fits with their values, they can engage. In that, the hard part of that story that I started out with, there were conservatives who didn't think they had a solution that fit with their values. It's called solution aversion. And so they doubted the existence of the problem. But if you can show them a solution that, say, Milton Friedman would be proud of, then they can engage. I do acknowledge, though, that in my own party, there's a little problem in that it's not all conservatives. Some are populist nationalists there, and they're not really sure who Milton Friedman was, or maybe they don't care who Milton Friedman was. But for those of us who know to sort of bow at the mention of Milton Friedman's name, the father of modern conservatism, we know that he's the guy. Anyhow, so that's our story. That's our song. I've told you I told you the story that we need to write the conclusion of. I told you how I got to this, and then I ran through the 3 policy options available to us: regulate it, incentivize it, or make dirty accountable. Having done all that, let me stop and see what questions or comments you've got for me. I'm happy to hear suggestions too as to how we're going to write this story, how we're going to write the conclusion of this story.
Thanks, Bob. We've already got a lot of good questions. As a reminder for folks, if you can put your questions in the Q&A button rather than the chat, because they tend to get lost in the chat as we scroll down. Frank, I think you put one in the chat earlier on. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Former House, I'm sorry, Bob Inglis already answered it.
Okay, great. Let's see, we've got from John, does the carbon tax with border adjustments that you described differ from the carbon fee and dividend approach of Citizens Climate Lobby?
I'm on the board of CCE, Citizens Climate Education. So we're thick as thieves with CCL and CCE. They are very committed to the idea of a dividend as a way to recycle the revenue from a carbon tax. We're glad for that. We could go for that. I'd be happy for the story to be written, the ending of the story to be written that way. But we're a little bit more ecumenical, perhaps, because we would also take, say, a recycling method of reducing, especially payroll taxes, would be the one that the bill that I had, the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009, would have put on a carbon tax, but then cut payroll taxes, the FICA tax, FICA tax that you see on your paycheck at it's 6.2% that you see. The 6.2% that your employer pays, you don't see unless you're self-employed, in which case you get to see the entirety of that tax. It's a pretty big tax, 12.4% on the first dollar of income, whether you're working at McDonald's or Microsoft. If you reduce that tax and put on a carbon tax, the Congressional Budget Office says the bottom 70% of Americans do better, because by that method, you really address the regressivity of a carbon tax. I sound like an economist here using terms like regressivity, but if you've had Econ 101, you know that regressivity is the concept of a tax that hurts poor people more than it affects wealthy people. So a carbon tax by itself is regressive. As a conservative, I think that's a problem. That conservatives should be the first people to express concern about regressivity. If we actually are conservative, then we believe that the test of conservatism is it works for everyone, including poor people. If it only works for wealthy people, well, that's an oligarchy. There's a country right now that you could go to if you like that form of economic functioning. They invade their neighbors. They're murderous. They're pretty nasty folks. But if you want to go live in such a place, there's a country available to you. But I want conservatism to be the first to say, no, we care about poor people, and we want to make sure that this philosophy works for everyone. So we address regressivity, can do that through a dividend. That helps with regressivity. The other way to do it is through a cut in the payroll tax, which really quite effectively deals with the regressivity problem. And to give you an example of the regressivity, if you put on a $40 per ton price in carbon dioxide at the mine, at the pipeline, the price of gasoline goes up at the local gas station by about 40 cents a gallon. Not a big deal if you're wealthy. But if you're poor and you drive a long way to get to work because you have to live a long way out from that work in order to get cheaper accommodations, that 40 cents is a big part of your budget. And so we got to deal with that regressivity problem. And I do it by cutting FICA taxes or by dividend the money from the carbon tax back to citizenry. Either one will work.
Thanks, Bob. Marianne asked, how do you determine what to tax and at what rate?
Yeah, great question. The bill that I had was $15 a ton, rising to $100 a ton over 30 years time, but I was always open to starting wherever you want to start. Most people, I think now, are really talking about $40 a ton. That seems to be a number that a lot of people are settling on. There's no holy writ about what the number should be. The idea is to try to figure out what are those side effects that the dirty should be made accountable for, and how do you price those in? And so let's say it's $40 a ton. As I said, that the most people would do that in what's called an upstream application of the carbon tax. That means at the mine, at the pipeline. There are only 2,000 companies in the United States that either mine coal or put stuff in a pipeline. You know how pipeline works, by the way, is, they run jet aviation fuel down the pipeline, and then they put in this thing called a pig, a membrane, and then they put diesel behind that, and they run that down the pipeline, same pipes. Then they put in another pig, the membrane thing, and they run 87 octane gasoline down to your gas station. That's what a pipeline does. All those fuels, we know from that chemical equation we were talking about earlier, how much CO2 is going to be emitted when it's burned. So you apply the tax based on what will be the tons of CO2 emitted from the burning of that stuff. And so $40 per ton is a number that a lot of people settle on or start with. That results, as I said earlier, in 40 cents a gallon on the price of gasoline going up. But let's be honest too, the price of everything goes up. That's the challenge here politically, right? The price of everything goes up, not just gasoline. The price of plastic forks goes up. The price of a cell phone goes up because of the components of it. The price of everything goes up. Oh, Inglis for Congress. He wants the price of everything in your life to go up. Well, okay, not such a good political start there, right? But what if we give you your money back from that carbon tax, or cut your payroll taxes so you got a fuller paycheck? Now then, how do you feel about paying a little bit extra, the true cost of plastic forks, let's say? Maybe then you'll be looking for that wooden spork, because it may turn out to be cheaper because it's a renewable product. Cleaner becomes cheaper.
Monica says, hi, Bob, great to have you in class again this year. I think Monica joined us also last year for this class. Can you elaborate on how measuring consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions and including that in indices could fit with designing the carbon border tax tariffs?
Huh. How the, tell me that again, how the, what
So
would...
I think it's how do you measure greenhouse gas emissions and then design the border adjustment to match that?
Okay, yeah. So it's rather this, that if for example we did the $40 per ton price on carbon dioxide, then what we'd be asking is, on entry of goods from another country, do they have a $40 per ton price on carbon dioxide? If they had a $30 per ton, then we'd tax it $10 per ton. Basically, we'd figure out a way to plus it up to what ours is. And so that's the way the border adjustment works. It depends on country of origin as to what kind of mechanism they've got in place. Now, here's something that's interesting for us as Americans. We may be subject to a carbon border adjustment on our products going into the European Union starting in 2023. The EU, prior to the Ukrainian invasion of Ukraine by Russia, had been talking, and hopefully they're still going to be talking about a carbon border adjustment starting in 2023. So products that we send to the European Union would be taxed on entry because they're coming from a country, the United States, that does not have a carbon tax. Now, we may be able to argue, yeah, but we've got regulations and you should give us credit for those. Apparently that's, I'm not a trade lawyer, but apparently that's a hard case to make in the World Trade Organization. Really hard case. If you don't have a simple, straightforward, transparent tax, and they're charging a tax on inside the EU, it's hard to argue that our regulations are equivalent. You can try, but it's a hard case. So what's interesting about that, by the way, is prior to the invasion, there were news accounts that Russia was considering a carbon tax. And you might wonder, wow, Russia, really? The organized crime syndicate. That's what we said. I was on Foreign Affairs Committee, and we used to say it's not a country, it's an organized crime syndicate, a murderous organized crime syndicate, actually. And so they're considering a carbon tax. Why? Well, because all that natural gas that they're selling to the European Union would be taxed on entry into the EU. And the tax money would end up enriching the EU coffers. So Russia, even Russia, was considering a carbon tax because, well, if we collect the tax ourselves on Russian gas, the tax money ends up in Moscow. and the natural gas goes through the pipeline into the EU with no adjustment. So even Russia was considering a carbon tax. So our great hope is the US Senate might be able to consider it. If Russia can consider it, surely the US Senate might be able to as well.
One would hope so. A similar question from Chris. Have you been sharing these ideas about policy options with conservatives in other nations like Australia, Canada, and the UK? If so, how do they react there?
Yeah, interesting. I had an opportunity, wonderful opportunity, about 3 years ago, I guess it was, to spend 16 days all around Australia speaking to Aussie conservatives. It was a wonderful opportunity to reconnect with my friend that I mentioned earlier, Scott Heron, and travel with him actually and my wife all around the country for those 16 days. The reaction was pretty positive, although really just dependent on the United States acting, because we're the country that has the market that everybody wants access to. And so there's enormous power in that. And so our carbon border adjustment, if we do one, is going to be the powerful instrument. Australia doesn't have that much power. I mean, they're not a very large market. It's a beautiful big country, a continent actually, but it doesn't have many people, relatively speaking. And so access to their market is not, doesn't give them a great deal of power, but it gives us enormous power here to lead the world to solutions and make it in the interest of our trading partners to do what we're doing. And by the way, for conservatives out there, and especially for any students that want to tell their very conservative, maybe parents or grandparents, did you notice no international agreement? No bowing and scraping at the UN, no protracted negotiations, just a bold move by the United States. It says, we're going to tax carbon dioxide and you're going to pay for it when you bring goods into our country. And sure, we want your goods, bring them ahead, but carbon emissions anywhere or climate change everywhere, we're going to collect the tax for you. Oh, you want to do your own tax? Well, fine. That probably would make sense for you to do your own tax so that we don't collect it for you on entry. But if you don't want to do your own tax, keep on paying ours, because we've got an enormous deficit and a terrible debt. So keep on paying. Give till it hurts.
We've had a couple of people ask about, I really like this question. Why would so you talked about 3 solutions earlier: regulation and tax incentives and pricing carbon emissions. Why would they need to be mutually exclusive, or is it an option to have all of these options on the table?
Well, they clearly, we do need some part of all of them probably, but here's the advice I'd give you. If you're ever in the En-ROADS simulation as a contest, ENROADS, it sounds like it's our thing, Republic EN is not. It's from MIT. It's an econometric modeling device that basically sets up team competitions where you can have a competition with your friends to see who can cut emissions the most by adopting various policies. You choose a policy and then it shows you what you did, what you accomplished. And so let me help you win the competition. Choose a carbon tax first. If you do, you're going to win because that's the thing that drives the curve down most rapidly. But does it do the entire thing? No. Probably have to still do some things like regulate, even though I've said we break out in hives generally when we mention regulations, but you probably got to regulate, not take out the probably, you got to regulate fugitive emissions of methane, because those are not susceptible to a solution by a tax. That's really set up for a regulatory solution right there. And then the other one would be higher fuel economy standards for cars. That's another thing you'd probably want to pick if you're doing the En-ROADS simulation, because now you choose a carbon tax first, you do the fugitive emissions of methane regulation, you require higher fuel economy for cars, you're pretty much winning the competition at that point. So I've told you now how to win the En-ROADS competition if you get in that game.
I put the link in the chat. I do really recommend you look at the En-ROADS simulator. It's a fascinating tool, very easy to use, has fun little sliders that you can move around. And what it does is you can practice implementing different policies to see what kind of impact that has on global temperature rise. It's a very cool tool. We got one more question, and then we're going to introduce Bill here for our second half, who has jumped on already. But last question, why FICA? How would Social Security and Medicare be funded if you're reducing FICA tax?
Oh, great question. See, not many people know that FICA funds Social Security. So here's the thing. We got to keep Social Security no worse than it already is bad. You know, I got to tell you, Mitt Romney was right when he went to Florida that time and called it a Ponzi scheme. It is most certainly a Ponzi scheme. That's what Social Security is. I'm a conservative. I will say it. I'm not running for president, and I'm not in Florida, so I can say it and survive. It was set up when people wouldn't live as long as they live now, and so the result is that Social Security is unstable. And if you read any of the reports from the trustees of the Medicare and Social Security Trust Fund, they're apoplectic about what's the future of Social Security. So we can't make it any worse than it already is bad. So this carbon tax would cause a declining revenue source. I think that's what the questioner is onto, is if you replace the FICA tax revenue with carbon tax revenue. So immediately Social Security is kept at least where it is. But here's the problem that I think the questioner is anticipating. Over time, those receipts for the carbon tax would go down because people would be choosing cleaner over the dirty, because the dirty is now more expensive because of the carbon tax. And so as people make that substitution, it's called the substitution effect, receipts for Social Security would go down. So that calls on us to have a steadily rising carbon tax. And that's a good thing, to make it, say, $40 a ton, but steadily rising to overcome the substitution effect. But you're onto something. You got to make sure that Social Security is kept at least as solvent as it is now. And that's the way to do it, by a steadily rising carbon tax. So I've got to get off the stage here, because you got better things to hear from Bill McKibben, who will be inspiring and interesting to listen to, and handsome and all of that too. So there he is.
Well, Bob, so thank you so much. I really appreciate your time as always. And it's great to see you again. And thank you for the work that you do. And folks, do check out republicen.org and sign up to be involved. It's a great organization that does really good work. So thanks so much, Bob. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Brian. Have at Bill. Tell him what's what. See ya.
Will do, brother.
Okay. See ya.
Will do.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Bob. Well, fun night. I always enjoy what Bob has to say, just as I always enjoy what Bill has to say, and really pleased to introduce for you our second speaker tonight, as we're talking about politics and advocacy. And I honestly can't think of anyone more enmeshed in climate change advocacy than Bill McKibben. Many of you probably recognize his name. He is a very prolific author. He's written more than 20 books, including the 1989 End of Nature, the first book on global warming written for a general audience way back in the 1980s. Bill McKibben is the founder of 350.org, the first global grassroots organization advocating on climate change, has helped organize protests on every continent, played a key role in the anti-Keystone Pipeline movement, the fossil fuel divestment campaign, and numerous other campaigns as well. Bill, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening, and welcome to our class here.
Well, it's great pleasure to be with you in your class. I'm really an honor to get to join you, and greetings from the mountains of Vermont. We had a late season snow yesterday, and today was a beautiful sunny day with the wildflowers peeking up through the snow as one wandered the woods, and couldn't have been nicer. So I'm in a good mood at the end of the day. Tell me what your format is here. You want me to talk for a little while? Or do we want to? I'd love to answer questions from people. What do you tell me? What's what?
Well, why don't you start off and just share a little bit about your experience with climate advocacy, what climate advocacy looks like, maybe share some stories related to that, why climate advocacy matters, and then we can have opportunity for folks to ask questions after that.
Sure. Well, in a way, let me pick up where Bob left off. Here's the interesting question. We face the biggest problem that the world has ever faced by far. It was 70 degrees Fahrenheit above normal in the Antarctic the week before last. Not good. We face the biggest problem the world's ever faced by far. We have all kinds of solutions for it. At root, those solutions are the fact that we now know how to cheaply use the sun and the wind to generate power. We have all the policy prescriptions you can imagine. Bob just ran through a whole slate of things. But you may have noticed that despite all his good work, those are all cloud castles. None of them have ever happened, and he's never been able, no one's ever been able to get a single Republican to vote for any of them who actually had a job in Congress. And at the moment, we can't get even a kind of modest version of any of them through the Senate because Joe Manchin, who's taken more money from the fossil fuel industry than anybody else, won't let it happen. And I've tipped my hand there at the end as to what the reason for all this inaction is. It's not like we've been having an argument about climate change. We haven't for a very long time. The argument's been over for 25 years. Everyone's known exactly what's going on. Everyone's known what we need to do to fix it. And no one's done it because instead of an argument, we've been having a fight. And the fight, as fights are usually, is not about data and reason and evidence. The fight's just about money and power. And the fossil fuel industry, I'm no theologian. I'm just a Methodist Sunday school teacher, but I would wager that the fossil fuel industry has more money than God, and they have been willing to spend it in abundance to make sure that nothing ever changes. And so far, they've won. So my work for the first 15 years I was engaged in this, or 10 or 15, was mostly on the argument side, writing more books. I still do all of that. But in the last 15 years, it's been more on the fight side, trying to figure out how we build countervailing power to the fossil fuel industry. So I'll lay my cards on the table. These guys are evil. We know now from great investigative reporting that the big oil companies knew everything there was to know about climate change back in the 1980s. Exxon, then the biggest company in the world, big staff of scientists. Their product was carbon. Of course, they were going to figure out what was going on, and they did. Their scientists, by the early 1980s, back when I was just beginning work on the book and things, informed their executives what the temperature was going to be in 2020 and what the CO2 concentration was going to be. And they were spot on, uncannily prescient. And they were believed. Exxon started building all its drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was coming. They began plotting precisely what parts of the Arctic they wanted to drill in once they'd melted it. The only thing they didn't do was tell the rest of us about this. Instead, across the industry, they spent billions of dollars building this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation, and pretending for 3 decades that we didn't know what was going on when we very well did. There was an absurd, sterile debate for 3 decades about whether or not global warming was real. A debate, remember, that both sides knew the answer to at the beginning. It's just one of them was willing to lie. And, they've kept it up. And what they did, among other things, was take what should have been a simple, straightforward question of survival and turn it into a poisonous political thing. look, in 1988, when Jim Hansen first testified to Congress about climate change, we had a Republican president in the White House, George H.W. Bush, and he said, and I quote, something to the effect of, "This is really serious, but we will fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect." That was a pretty good line, and it was a good, straightforward response. Why wouldn't you? I mean, you've been warned by scientists that something terrible is going to happen. Of course, you mobilize to do something about it. But, and for those of you who watch Don't Look Up, this is sort of recapping the story. I mean, 30 years later, after telling that lie over and over and over again, we had another Republican president in the White House, and he said, global warming is a hoax manufactured by the Chinese. An idea so mind-numbingly crazy that if you were sitting on a public bus next to someone muttering it, you would get up and switch seats, But that's what happens when you can do this for 30 years. So what we started doing 15 years ago was organizing to build movements big enough to challenge their power. Because lacking billions of dollars, we had to substitute millions of bodies. And that work was necessarily slow at first because you're starting from nothing. 350.org was the first iteration of a global climate movement. And because we had some beginner's luck, I guess, and because there was an unfilled ecological niche, it went well. I started it with 7 college students here in Vermont, and there were 7 continents, so each one took one. And the guy who had to take the Antarctic also had to take the internet, and we organized like crazy. And 2 years later, we had the first big global day of action, 5,200 simultaneous demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. They were mostly small because it was a beginning, but it's grown quickly. We spearheaded the fight around the Keystone Pipeline, which turned into a 10-year huge saga, the biggest environmental fight in many years, and we won. And it was the first defeat for big oil on any big thing like this. And happily, more importantly, it spawned 1,000 other, no one builds any pipelines anymore without getting a big fight in return, or frack wells or anything else. And then we started this fossil fuel divestment movement, which has grown into the biggest anti-corporate campaign in history. We're at about $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested from fossil fuel. It recapped what people had done a generation previously in response to apartheid in South Africa. And the first person that we called to ask if it was okay to do it was Archbishop Tutu. And he said, please take this tool because climate change is the human rights issue of our time, as apartheid was a generation ago. And so we have. We've got an extraordinary number of institutions, pension funds, everything else to join in. I mean, including many of the world's most important institutions of higher education. Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge and the University of California and the University of Michigan down the street, and on and on and on. And many religious denominations that have joined in as part of this, which has been gratifying for me. One of the great advocates of this work has become the guy who's probably the best environmental campaigner, best male environmental campaigner in the world, Pope Francis. And another is one of my favorite people in the whole world, Greta Thunberg, who's done huge amounts to help. And all this work has been very useful. The best thing about all this movement building is that lots of other people have flooded into this space. So Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement, and most beautifully represented by Greta, all those high school and junior high school students all over the world. There are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs, and they have 10 million followers, and they get this on a deeper level than pretty much anyone else. I love working with them all. But I began to get worried a little while ago that it was really not quite right to ask 17-year-olds to solve the world's gravest problem, sort of in between algebra homework and field hockey practice. Could you also please stop climate change? And so I've been the last year or so organizing old people like me. We have this group called Third Act for people over 60. So tell your grandparents. And it's been really fun. It's got
looks like we froze up, I think. Bill, can you hear me there? Hold on, folks. Looks like we're frozen up here. Yep, you're good.
okay. Good. I was just saying we're getting old people going, and we're taking on, in particular, the banks that provide the funding for the fossil fuel industry. Chase City, Wells Fargo, Bank of America have given this industry $1 trillion since the Paris Climate Accords were signed. They didn't need Donald Trump to sabotage the whole thing. They were happy to do it themselves in search of a little profit. It's an ugly business, and I'm not going to tell you that we're necessarily going to win this fight, because I don't know. Our problem is not that we're going to lose in the long run. Eventually, we're going to run this planet on sun and wind. 50 years from now, that's what it'll run on, because sun and wind are pretty cheap. The problem is, if it takes anything like 50 years to get there, it's going to be a broken planet that runs on sun and wind. I didn't spend any time talking about the science of where we are. I can do it all day, but I assume that you guys have done a lot of talking about that
Yeah,
already.
we covered that pretty well. We did have Catherine Hayhoe earlier too.
Oh, good. Well, in that case, she's the best. So I work with old people. I published my first children's picture book yesterday from Rent House. So I work with little kids and college students and everybody I can think of. And the message I just keep telling everybody is, you got to get outside your comfort zone, because the planet is way outside its comfort zone. And that's going to mean different things for different people. For me, sort of unexpectedly, it's meant ending up in handcuffs over and over and over again, along with a lot of other kinds of organizing. But it'll mean different things for different people. But if you care about creation, just be well aware that we're running Genesis in reverse right now, and decreating things at an astonishing rate. So figuring out how to interfere with that process is a good thing to be thinking about.
Bill, how about I start us off with a question here. You referenced civil disobedience there. Sometimes I know you've been arrested numerous times for a variety of different things. In your opinion, share with us why you think sort of the more confrontational approaches like civil disobedience, what role do those play in advocacy generally, and are those valuable, and why?
So first thing is, you shouldn't use them very often. They're a tool in an activist toolbox, but if too often, it gets old. But there are moments when you need ways to underline the moral urgency of something. And this is an important one. Nonviolent civil disobedience was a basically 20th century invention. And it came from the margins, from the suffragettes, from Gandhi and anti-colonialists in India and elsewhere, and from Dr. King and 100,000 other civil rights advocates whose names we don't know as well. And they developed kind of alchemical, it is a kind of alchemy a strange kind, where powerlessness, it turns out to be a kind of power, um, and over and over again has been shown to be effective. Erica Chenoweth at Harvard has done a lot of work, a political scientist, to demonstrate that in the last 75 years, it's been far, far more effective than violent efforts at making change. And I commend that work to you. I think that one of the reasons that it shouldn't work, like getting arrested merely demonstrates your powerlessness, really. But on the other hand, in our tradition, in the Western tradition, I think it has sort of usually unacknowledged but deep emotional links to the story of the crucifixion. The kind of in Western history, and to the idea that unearned suffering is an extraordinarily powerful moral force. So to see people literally turning the other cheek is it works a certain kind of sometimes strange magic. Now, as I said before, I don't think it's the main thing that people need to be doing all the time. It only works if it's part of a big campaign that works on all kinds of other ways that are more prosaic and whatever. And I also don't necessarily think, this is one of the places where I don't think young people should have to be the main cannon fodder here. I wrote the letter asking people to come to DC to get arrested at the start of the Keystone fight, in a moment when no one knew about it and no one thought that we could succeed. One of the things I said in that letter was, I don't think young people should have to do this. If you're 19, an arrest record might not be so good on your resume. Past a certain age, what the hell are they going to do to you? You know, and as it turned out, more people turned out to get arrested at this thing than on any other thing in many, many years in this country, 1,250 some over 2 weeks. We didn't ask people, how old are you, when they were getting arrested? But we did say, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest cohorts were from the FDR and the Truman administrations. And it was good. It was good for young people who were there to see elders acting the way we actually need them to act in our society. And it was good for them to feel a kind of agency and power. And so I think I could talk about civil disobedience, nonviolent movement building all night. I think that along with the solar panel, it's the most important technology developed in the 20th century. And I think that together, the two of them hold some kind of possible route out of the predicament in which we find ourselves now.
That's great, thank you. Reminder for folks, feel free to put questions in the Q&A chat function there. Bill, we got a question from Peter. How do we speak to persons who tend to resist climate change policy because they fear what they will lose? Because they fear that they will lose their capacity to maintain adequate financial resources during the transition.
So expand a little bit. Who are we thinking about in this case?
He doesn't specify in the Q&A, but I'm guessing just generally people who are resistant to climate change policy because they're afraid of the transition process.
Right. I was sort of I wonder whether he was describing people who work in the fossil fuel industry, you know, oil field workers or something. So there's, I'll try in several ways to answer it. For people who are employed in that industry, there's no question that we need a just transition of some kind. And indeed, every climate bill that people have put forward for decades has put up money for just that kind of retraining and whatever else, for make a just transition. And always it's been blocked by the fossil fuel industry and their friends in Congress, because it's been far more useful for them to hold those workers hostage and use them. You can see this most dramatically right now with Joe Manchin in the Senate. Obviously, the guy holds an insanely strong hand. He gets to decide whether this thing passes or not. So it would not be hard for him. There are 50,000 coal miners in West Virginia left. Would not be hard for him to negotiate a full-on gold-plated pension for every single one of them. I mean, if Joe Manchin said tomorrow, I want you to plumb the Monongahela River so it, runs whiskey 5 days a week and Coca-Cola on Saturdays, Joe Biden would figure out a way to make that happen too. But instead, he just keeps carrying water, not for his constituents, but for his industry, and it's gross. If we're talking about people in general who are worried about the transition to renewable technology and things, well, I mean, the good news is it's, especially with a little bit of government help, it's not ruinously expensive, just the opposite. Ford is, marketing their, as of this week, the F-150 electric pickup. The F-150 is the most popular vehicle in America for the last 40 years. So the electric one doesn't cost more to buy than the gas one. And when it comes to what it costs to operate, it's way, way less. Because it has very few moving parts, so it doesn't go to the shop very often. But B, because the price of electricity doesn't spike the way that the price of gas does. I confess to a certain amount of, a certain amount of unpleasant gas. I've got solar price did last week, and that it will next week. So I think that entirely possible much more quickly if that's what's in that Build Back Better bill, is $500 billion for just this kind of work. $500 billion that would be very smart to spend, because the price of avoiding climate change is almost immeasurable, and the price of just the big study from Oxford last year that showed that a quick transition to renewable energy, forget the damages from climate change that you avoid, would save $20 trillion over the next decade, just because you don't have to buy fuel anymore. That's the point. Once you've put up the solar panel, then the sun delivers the energy for free every morning when it rises above the horizon. That's why Exxon hates it so much. They think that's the stupidest business model in the world, because they've had people writing them a check every month forever for more than 100 years to get their next load of energy. And, it's an insult to them to imagine that it would come every day delivered automatically by the sun or by the wind. That's why they've fought it so hard. So, if we can figure out how to break their take, this has been talking about the sunrise movement, doesn't matter. There's an enormous number of people with goodwill, with basically the same set of ideas about what we need to do, and we just can't do them because the powers and principalities of our moment are so far still in the way.
Bill, we got about 95% of what you said, but we missed the first paragraph or so. You started off saying, I confess something, And then we missed your confession.
I can't remember now what it was about either.
Okay, that's okay. It was a few minutes ago. Different question here about public transportation. What's the best? Public transportation has a bit of a tarnished image in the US. So what's the best way to advocate for better, cleaner public transportation options?
It is hard work in this country because, and this goes to a deep philosophical and almost theological point. I mean, the reason is that at least since Ronald Reagan, we don't like public anything in this country. We like private everything. And we became a highly hyper individualized society where people resent having to sit on a bus next to other people, So there's ways around that. You can make public transportation. We know things that make public transportation work. It needs to come regularly so that you're not standing out there for a long time waiting for the bus. It needs to move quickly, which is completely possible to do if you put in, say, bus lanes. I wrote a piece almost 30 years ago now about the city in Brazil that invented what we now call bus rapid transit, that spread all over Asia and South America, where you get long double articulated buses with doors that open like subways, and they have dedicated lanes to drive on. What you've basically done is build a subway on the street, and it works fast, really fast, and it's like a hundredth the cost of building a subway. Okay, and the only people who don't like it are sometimes drivers, because you have to take a lane away from cars. But go sometime and just look at see how many people have done these great sort of demonstrations of how much space 50 people take up in cars by themselves and in a bus, and then on bicycles. I think it's going to be a while before we make we should be working hard to make huge inroads on both bikes and buses. But to be realistic, 95% of passenger miles traveled in the US right now are in private cars and trucks. So we better grapple with that and understand that at least for a generation, electric cars are going to be an important part of this answer too. But man, get people out on e-bikes whenever you can, because that's cool technology. And in the rest of the world that's not quite as addicted to cars, e-bikes are they're outselling every other form of transportation in Asia at the moment.
Bill, one of my favorite books of yours, right here, Deep Economy. Folks, if you haven't read this, really excellent read. And one of the things I really like about this book is it projects a really exciting and positive and hopeful vision for what a sort of a sustainable economy could look like, and does look like. Most of this, you're using your local Vermont as an example of that. I wonder if you could share with us some stories for like things that give you hope for like, yes, here's an indicator of something that's really working on transforming us around the climate crisis, and you see as a positive indicator toward the future.
Well, I mean, when I was writing Deep Economy, I was writing a lot about things like farmers markets and things, and they're continuing to go strong and be important and good examples, but they haven't scaled to become a huge part of our food system the way we would need them to be if climate change was goal. Scale is often a problem. There are things that are potentially starting to, I mean, I hope anyway I don't know. I mean, the premise of that book, Deep Economy, was that humans need connection and community above all, and that we're happier when we have them, and they're also far more efficient in because instead of constantly buying stuff, we're just doing things with people and hanging out and building communities and things. I think the evidence for all of that is completely strong, but I also think that we're in a moment right now where it's hard to be super optimistic about some of that. I mean, I try to remind myself that during this pandemic we've just come through, most Americans behaved pretty well. Certainly where I am, I'm lucky Vermont led the country in vaccinations and mask wearing, and as a result, it trailed the country in number of people who died. But I try to remind myself that most people did the right thing, because truthfully, it was kind of embarrassing to watch how many of our countrymen found it incredibly hard to restrain themselves in any way to benefit the people around them, and that was sad to watch. I find it particularly sad because, because theoretically we're a Christian nation, but you wouldn't know it some of the time when you look at what we do and how we behave. So I don't know. I hope that we can figure out how to build the kind of strong community things. And one of the reasons I like renewable energy is because it points us in that direction. It's a very good thing, just like with a farmer's market, to have, in essence, a farmer's market in electrons, to have community solar projects, and there's now thousands of them across the country, and to have energy coming from nearby instead of far away is a useful thing in building those kind of communities. And I'm sorry if I'm not being more completely positive. The last few years in this country have shaken me, I gotta say. The idea that we would have elected someone like Trump, and that we would have handled the pandemic the way we did and things, I would never have thought either of those things to be possible in the country I grew up in. But my most recent book, which will be out next month, is sort of about what happened to that country and where it went, including what happened to the church and where it went. The title is "The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon," but the more compelling part is probably the subtitle: "A graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders what the hell happened." So.
Yeah, I saw the title for your book when I was looking up your bio online, and I'm intrigued. I'm really anxious to get a hold of that and read one of them. What other questions do you guys have? Throw them in the Q&A, or panelists, you guys can unmute yourselves and ask a question. I'll throw another one out there, Bill. Tell us a story about an advocacy that you were involved with that you felt like, yeah, this really worked. Like this really was effective right here. This hit the mark. It's made an impact. It's made a difference.
Well, I mean, look, I'm forever be proud of the fact that we killed off the Keystone Pipeline. That's 800,000 barrels a day of the dirtiest oil on earth. It's not going to come up from underground. And that's, if I don't ever do anything else in the world, that's probably enough to have justified the time and angst that it took. I've been I think that the divestment campaign has been extremely powerful, partly because we provided a vehicle for people in many, many places to take on this question. Most people don't have an oil well or a coal mine or a pipeline in their backyard, but everybody's adjacent to a pot of money. A university endowment, a church pension fund, a public employees pension fund, whatever it is. And so each of those became, we were having the fight about global warming, and hence the ability to talk about it and educate people and move people and put people on the spot. We were having that not in a few places, but in 10,000 places. And each of them was powerful and important. And there's been a lot of academic research to suggest that this was the thing that during the last decade did more than any other to kind of keep people focused on climate change and the role of the fossil fuel industry in it. And we've won a ton of those fights. It took immense amounts of work by, so many people. It was a little like I started it. Well, Naomi Klein and I sort of had the idea and got it going, but it was like the, scene in Tom Sawyer where he starts whitewashing the fence, and pretty soon everybody else is doing all the work. People took it up everywhere, and sometimes they won, sometimes they lost and kept at it and eventually won. It took colleges, it often took 2 or 3 generations of undergraduates carrying on the fight before places went in. But man, when they went, it made a huge difference. The kids who divested Harvard year after year after took 10 years, but the victory was enormous. Same at University of Michigan, same at Georgetown, same at all kinds of places. And if you guys want to do some more work along those lines, it'll be really useful.
Cheryl gives a big yes, thank you, all caps, thank you for stopping the Keystone Pipeline. And Marianne asked a good question here. As an advocate, what would you recommend churches do? What might be a first step for churches?
Well, so the first step question is an interesting one, because the first steps, the sort of easy things, are things that some people have been working on for a couple of decades now, groups like Interfaith Power and Light and things. And they're, the things you would expect. Get the sexton to figure out how to, put efficient light bulbs in and turn down the thermostat and, so on and so forth in church. Sadly, we're past the point where you can make the climate math work like that. We've waited so long to do anything that now we need far bigger action. So the hope is that we can get churches to join in some of this activism, some of the campaigning, either around political things or around the financial system, because those are the only 2 levers big enough to pull that matter at this point. So we've had lots of work from churches divesting from fossil fuel, and increasingly working on calling out the banks and trying to get them to do the right thing. And it's been very powerful to watch. Some denominations, entire denominations, have divested. The Episcopalians, the Lutherans, Unitarians, broad swath of Christendom has come on board. And the Catholic Church, as I said before, has been extraordinarily strong. My Methodists have yet to do the right thing. And it's gotten, the further you get into sort of evangelical Christianity, the more resistant congregations have been, which I confess I don't understand in the least, because as I said, I'm just Sunday school teacher, but the very first page of the darn book, our job is to steward creation, take care of things, and instead we're busily decreating everything around us. All those things that God created day after day, we're rapidly killing off, and that's crazy. And when you turn to the gospel, again, I'm just a simple Sunday school teacher, but it's pretty clear that the main message is love your God and love your neighbor. And we're drowning our neighbors, giving them hideous diseases, making it impossible for them to raise food, driving them from their homes as deserts spread, on and on and on. And that's us doing it. I mean, the 4% of us who live in America have produced 25% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's hard to think of any greater challenge to justice than that. That's the case that Francis makes so powerfully in his encyclical in Laudato Si. So truthfully, I don't quite understand how a lot of organized Christianity in this country, I don't quite understand how it lives with itself in the face of all of this, but on we go.
On we go. On that note, by the way, on divesting from fossil fuels, that's something that you can do with your own personal investments as well. I did that about 5 or 6 years ago. There are many now mutual funds, Roth IRA, retirement funds that are fossil fuel free options. And actually, many of them do very well. My retirement savings has not taken a hit by divesting from fossil fuels. It has continued to exceed the market rate.
And if you've got credit cards from Chase and Citi and Wells and B of A, which means if you have a Amazon credit card or United Miles, Air Miles card or anything, we're going to all cut them up at the end of the year if we haven't made some progress with these guys. So join on in, because you can always, trust me, someone will give you another credit card.
On that note, Kevin asked, divesting is clearly a morally good thing to do, but can you explain the real world impact this has in slowing down the fossil fuel industry?
Sure. Twofold. One, it takes away their social license to a large degree, which was the original reason they hated it so much and fought it so hard. Because if important institutions say, we here, the Episcopalian Church, want nothing to do with the fossil fuel industry, that's a powerful signal. And so it has been. The other thing it does is restrict their access to capital. If you've taken $40 trillion off the table from funds that no longer, that's $40 trillion that they have to find their money somewhere else. It's not impossible. They find it to some degree, but it makes it harder and more expensive. And that's why, say, when Peabody Coal went bankrupt, they said divestment was one of the reasons. Shell Oil, in their annual report year before last, said that divestment had become a material risk to their business, which was good because their business is a material risk to life on planet Earth. So that's what we want to see.
Anne raised her hand. Anne, you want to ask your question?
Thank you. I think it's an honor to be able to ask quickly. One thing I just wanted to comment is I was treasurer of a scientific professional society and was able to organize for us to divest. And I think that a lot of those societies is very consistent with being a scientific society. And so it's a good opportunity to maybe, if you're a member of one, to ask them if they could consider it. My actual question was, as a biologist, I'm confronted with this day in and day out. There's no escaping the reality of thinking about climate change and understanding the magnitude of the problem. Someone had asked me last year, how do you keep thinking about it? It's easier to just not think about it. It just seems like there's so much magnitude to a problem. And how do you continue to think about it? I just can't think about it. It's too hard. It's too scary. It's too worrying. And so my response to that was, I feel like every fraction of a degree matters, and it's too important not to think about it. It may be hard, it may be excruciating, but it's too important not to. And you've been doing so much for so long. I wonder what your advice would be to those people who say, I just can't think about it anymore. It's too hopeless.
So first of all, many thanks for your help getting your society divested. And the fact that scientists are playing an ever more aggressive role is really important. There were 1,000 scientists did civil disobedience last week to just because they were pissed off because they were like, well, we keep writing these reports, so, and you don't pay attention to them. So what do you want from us? Second thing, the platypus is excellent. And third thing is, yeah, like I get why people get frustrated and why it seems very, very hard. And that's why my job as an organizer, my volunteer job as an organizer, is to figure out always how to give people some sense of agency, some plausible sense that what they're doing might work, might be helpful. And that's why, and sometimes there's a leap of faith aspect to that. I mean, when we started the Keystone Pipeline fight, there really was no good reason to think that we could win. But a bunch of things broke just perfectly in our direction, and suddenly we had a good fight on our hands, and so it went. That's why I don't worry about taking on these really big fights, because on the one hand, it's obviously easier to win little tiny fights. But it's easier for people to understand that if they're doing something large, it's going to be hard, but if it succeeds, then it really matters. So that's why, at some level, it's ludicrous to take on the biggest banks in the world. This is the capital in capitalism, but at some other level, it makes sense because that's what one has to go through. That's the wall that one has to go through if we're going to get where we need to go. So the other thing I would say is organizing and advocacy have to be done in ways that are spiritually satisfying for people. And that's, very different depending on who you are and what community you're in and things. When we're doing this organizing now with old people like me, one of the things we're trying hard to do is connect people up with who they were in their youth, because people who are in their 70s, 80s now, in their youth were around for some very cool stuff. The birth of the women's movement and the civil rights movement and the first Earth Day and things. And one of the ways that we connect them up with that is by reminding them that of what it felt like then. This was fight me if you want, but this was the generation that produced the best music ever. And so we've been very lucky to be able to get some of those iconic figures to come help out. Carole King and Bette Midler and Neil Young and, people like that. And that really, it's amazing how much that helps. Environmentalists do a pretty good job of appealing to whichever hemisphere of the brain it is that likes bar graphs and pie charts, but not a very good job historically in appealing to whichever the other hemisphere of the brain is that reacts to the world somewhat more viscerally and emotionally and things. And so that's always been important to me as a part of this work.
Thank you very much.
It's a practical question here from Kimberly. How do we find the facts on how our financial institution is performing in key areas like funding fossil fuel projects?
Yes, you go to a report called Banking on Climate Chaos. The 2022 edition just came out, and this has all the big banks in the world. Probably if you're in a local credit union or something, your money's pretty clean in this regard. So don't worry about it too much. But if you're connected in some way with any of the couple hundred big banks in the world, that Banking on Climate Chaos report will provide you with all the gory details of exactly what they're doing to try and destroy the planet in return for 7%.
That's great. Thanks, Bill. I actually didn't know about that resource, but I just found it and put it in the chat there. That looks great. I'm going to take a look at that later. Nancy says, thank you, Bill, for your amazing advocacy and inspiration. Do you think passing laws about the rights of nature would be a help in curbing species extinction and corporation dominance in places like the Amazon? God bless you.
I think it would be a big help. But I think it's really hard for all the reasons we've described. It's really hard to do. But that's the one place in South America where actually there have been a couple of examples of this. Ecuador has enshrined the rights of nature in its constitution, and I believe Bolivia as well. In both cases, because there's strong indigenous power in those places. And it's beginning to look like the Brazilian election in the fall may turn on environmental issues in a serious way. The guy who's currently running Brazil is one of the worst people in the whole world, a guy named Bolsonaro. And one of the many ways in which he's truly bad is that he's allowed people to cut almost at will in the Amazon, which is terrifying for the world because we desperately need that standing forest. And it's terrifying for Brazilians because it's changing their local climate in profound ways as well. And the reaction may be building, I mean, the guy who's his main opponent and who's ahead of him right now is running very strongly on environmental issues at the moment. And that kind of rights of nature thing may be a part of what they're talking about. If you're interested in that particular question, there's a really terrific piece 2 weeks ago in the New Yorker by the wonderful writer Elizabeth Kolbert, Kolbert, about a case in Florida. That's the first effort of there's a pair of lakes suing a developer to stop a development. And it's a powerful story about what the world would look like if we gave standing in legal action to the natural world, which is not like a very far-fetched idea. We let corporations be people in legal terms. They're allowed to have and if you ask me, a tree is far more like a person than a corporation is, so I don't know why we don't give trees standing.
I got about 5 minutes left here. Frank, you got a question you want to ask?
Yeah, let me unmute here. As I was looking up some articles that you've written, Bill, I tripped on one that you wrote 9 years ago about naming hurricanes after fossil fuel companies. And it was a good thing I wasn't drinking coffee at the time, or my screen would have been covered. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, but that was
yes. It's funny. I wrote that along, and a lot of people have taken up that idea over the years. I just wanted it because I liked the idea of the imagining the weather guy going, Exxon is now ravaging the Florida coast. Watch out! Exxon has come ashore and is, producing killer winds that are, and so on. You can tell that my patience with the fossil fuel industry snapped a long time ago.
Oh.
And I do not think that these are. I'm sure that that whatever the people involved are like, the institution that they've joined together in has produced in them a willingness to do things that they should not have done. And there are days, I confess, when I'm not, here's what I'll confess to you all, since whatever I confessed before we missed, but there are days when I get up and think, I do not think, oh, we're going to solve climate change today or something. If I'm in a bad mood, I just think, oh, well, at least, how much trouble can I cause the oil companies today? That'll have to be sufficient for today to keep me going through it. Because, well, that's not a very Christian thing to say, but there you are.
I'm going to throw a link in the chat here. Bill referenced indigenous people in the Amazon. There's a really fascinating photo essay in the Washington Post from 2014, I think. I put the link in there to check it out. I first saw this actually in Paris at COP21 and was brought to tears at just the power of this. So encourage you to check that out. It's got some beautiful stories of women in the Amazon fighting oil
Beautiful.
companies.
Beautiful.
Okay, last question. I'm debating between two, but let's go with Peter's. What makes you hopeful these days?
Solar power is cheap. There's millions and millions of people pushing for change. Those things are really important, and so now it's just a fight. Can those forces in time overcome the power of vested interest? And we'll win eventually, but eventually doesn't do us much good. Once we've melted the Arctic, we don't have a good plan for how to freeze it back up again. So it'd be better to win right away. So that's why why it feels urgent to me and why I do the things I do. And I don't know if that's hopeful, but it's real. And so many thanks to those of you, and Brian in particular has been at this a long time, who we all fight shoulder to shoulder, and we get done what we can.
Many thanks to you for your many years of inspiring the rest of us. Thank you so much, Bill. And
all right.
Thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. We appreciate that.
God bless y'all.
God bless you.
Take good care.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. It's been a fun mix of speakers. Bill and Bob both have very different ways of coming at this, but I'm hoping that together it's been a very interesting mix of looking at different ways to approach from a politics and advocacy perspective on climate change, and giving you some interesting ideas to think about. I expect that there will be things that probably you love and you disagree with from both of what they've each had to say. And that's probably a good thing, because by finding different ways of looking at stuff, we're challenged to think things through ourselves. Thanks everyone for joining us. Next week, our last week, we have Chris Dorian, who is a professor from Pepperdine University, with us, and one of my closest friends in the world, Lowell Bliss, who is going to be closing us out with thoughts on spirituality of climate change and how do we as Christians wrestle with this problem and this crisis in a way that is helpful for moving forward and understanding the context within sort of the sphere of our faith and how we engage with that. So thanks so much, everyone. Look forward to seeing you again next week. Have a wonderful night.